Welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and to this discussion today on the shrinking space for human rights defenders in Asia. My name is Anna Wisslander. I'm Deputy Director here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to moderate this seminar. And we're also very pleased to organize this in a collaboration with the Right Livelihood Award Foundation and also with the Church of Sweden, Kvinna, Civil Rights Defenders, Amnesty Sweden, and CineMondo. And you are most welcome to join us on Twitter during the event. And if you do, please use the hashtag, which is behind me also, UI-event, UI-event. Many governments see civil society as a threat, and the political space of civil society organizations is shrinking all over the world. And it's the organizations and actors working in the areas of justice, human rights, and natural resources that are mostly severely hit by the various restrictions and threats. The Right Livelihood Award was established in 1980 to honor and support those offering practical and exemplary answers to the most challenging, urgent challenges facing us today. It has become widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. And the 2014 award ceremony will take place on Monday in the Swedish Parliament. We are very pleased to have with us today two of the 2014 Right Livelihood Award laureates. And we will listen to them today, and after that we will open up the floor also for comments and questions from you in the audience. We will have a break at 4:30, and at 5 o'clock there will also, during that break I should say, the cafeteria downstairs will be open, so you have possibility there to take some refreshments. I think we're making a switch here. And at 5:30 we will present the Swedish premiere screening of the documentary Unjust by Josefina Bergsten. And we will round up afterwards if there are questions also from the audience. We will be able to have a chat with Josefina after that. And that movie is about 70-80 minutes long. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker of this seminar. I'm sorry about that sound. Basil Fernando, a leading Asian human rights defender. Fernando and the Asian Human Rights Commission, AHRC, that he led for nearly 2 decades, have developed one of the world's most sophisticated urgent appeals systems. Through its human rights school and training initiatives, the AHRC has educated countless of lawyers and activists on the principles of fair trial and the rule of law, thereby greatly advancing an Asian movement working towards the realization of human rights for all. Basil Fernando and Asian Human Rights Commission will be awarded the Right Livelihood Award for his tireless and outstanding work to support and document the implementation of human rights in Asia. So please join me in welcoming up Basil Fernando to the stage.
I feel honored to be before you, and thank you very much for the kind words that you have spoken to talk about a topic which is, I think, of enormous importance in the present times. Though the title itself as shrinking space may have some not so clear a meaning, because after all, when we talk about human rights defenders space, we are primarily talking about the space that should be available to the people. And is the space available for the people shrinking? Well, I think it is it's a more mixed feeling, mixed meaning that is associated, that could be associated with that. I'll try to explain a little bit just to clarify. Now, if you take a place like Burma and Cambodia, what you have is not a shrinking space, but a certain expansion of space, given the many years of enormous silencing that has been done to those societies. I was a senior officer with the Cambodian Transitional Authority for Cambodia. At the time we went, there was nothing that could be called a space for the people. But with the intervention of the UN, with the people being given a chance to recover themselves, we saw an astounding recovery of the people's capacity to enter into political life. Usually, in the first few months, as we went along the different cities, if you ask even a driver, what do you think, there was the election, what do you think, where you vote and how do you like the parties, you will never get any kind of a committed answer. Everybody was keeping their thoughts to themselves. Then there was the elections, and the counting started, and then the message went round that the people who were controlling the major area called the State of Cambodia Party is in fact losing in the actual count. At that point, we had a meeting where we have invited international experts from Hong Kong, Professor Yashgai, and he was with a group of people who usually keep silent during meetings. And Professor Yashgai could not, talk very much in the meeting because people began to speak. And the whole meeting was a completely different experience to all of us. And thereafter, everywhere we found people talking. I could explain that what happened, at the very early stage, I call a group of people, about 30 people, beginners of the human rights movement, that there was no movement. People were trying to come for this. And I tried to encourage them to speak. Nobody will ever ask a question. 3 times I had this meeting. One day, one guy got up, because we were so much pressing that, ask some question. Then he got up and he said, how do I know whether the guy this side and guy this side sitting before me is not from the Ministry of Interior? Now that was how the silencing has happened. And when the people saw the change in the voting, they knew my neighbor is not my enemy. I have been thinking more or less the same way as my neighbor. We have both gone and voted the same way, although we were not speaking to each other about politics. So I think when we are talking about this theme, this complexity of, how there are restrictions, attempted restrictions and actual restrictions on the right of people who work on human rights issues, and also the political parties, and the way whether it how it affects the actual space and how people gain a space, all this should be taken into consideration. Because ultimately when we are speaking about shrinking, what we are talking is how are we to get back the space, how we are going to expand the space, and that is the issue. And about that, throughout Asia, you will find, I could only speak with the experience of Asia, enormous experiments of people trying to get back their space in extremely difficult times. So of course the governments have found various ways of to bring about restrictions. Yesterday I was in a similar meeting in Berlin, and then the main theme that many of them wanted to speak was the fact that in NGOs and human rights organizations, getting funding from outside has often to face some very legal limitations which are not reasonable. And very often this process of various regulations which are put, which in a developed democracy will be very harmless regulations, but they are used for the purpose of getting to know who are behind these organizations and to cause various kinds of harassments. That's one area of concern for many people. There are also other areas of concern, particularly for those engaged in media. There is a very serious attacks on media people. There's a killing of journalists is not a rare occurrence. It is sometimes, unfortunate to say, a very frequent occurrence. So that kind of attack on the people who could make opinion and who could galvanize the public opinion on issues is quite frequent. But I would like to speak of what I see is the major threat to the democratic participation of people in political life, which is inherent in dysfunctional legal systems. Bad policing, bad in the sense of using torture as the main medium of criminal investigation, is a common feature in almost all countries of Asia. The kind of 19th changes that happened in the 19th century in Europe, which also later happened in North America, has not happened in our part of the world. All concept of policing for suppression of people, particularly the poor, is a common phenomena. The bad policing virtually creates also enormous consequences within the court system. If a case is not investigated, if attack on a human rights defender or a political activist or a journalist is not investigated, and then virtually in the legal system there is nothing you can do, even if the judiciary is willing to do something about it. But unfortunately what we are also seeing is that sometimes with very good and very noble examples on the other direction, there is often the problems with the in many countries in the judiciary itself. Either some countries have never seen what can be called an independent judiciary, particularly people who are emerging from serious crises like Cambodia and Burma. These are completely politically controlled judicial system. Any political issue, giving a judgment in favor of against the government is not a possibility. So here using the legal systems to defend your rights can become just a circle or a circus sometimes. you go to the courts and you can go on for some countries for years. I have taken up many cases of torture victims and people who you have been killed extrajudicially, and people who have disappeared in some countries, and you go through 12 years over one simple case, and even at the end there is no result at the end. The sheer will of the some victims who simply want to fight for justice even in the face of seeing that the system doesn't work is one of the most encouraging sign to see that people simply not bow down. People don't accept the assault on their freedoms, severe forms of violence. There are people who are struggling to assert their rights strongly, but the system virtually keep them going on and on and on, and like this you can destroy the you know, it is not is a destroying of the space by making your actions that you take deliberately futile. Developing an idea that you do whatever you like, see whether you can change us. That kind of challenge inbuilt into a legal system can be a very formidable challenge for everybody. And of course, I speak with this with the most painful experience from my own country. A country that has one time seen some of the very remarkable development of the legal systems. Today, we have been humbled to a position that, you know, our judiciary is completely a politicized judiciary, directly appointed at the top level, directly appointed by the highest, the president, and who has to act according to the president. For example, if the president, when the president wants to have a longer term in the office, he sends asking opinion from the Supreme Court. Now I have spent 4 years of my time. I have 2 more years to go. Now I want to have an election now. Now when I have the election, you know, what is, you know, can I do that now? Meaning that if I lose, I stay another 2 years because I have 2 more years. If I win, I stay 8 years. Now the Supreme Court very humbly, with all kinds of, you know, things to hide, you know, actual meanings, with all kinds of, you know, quotation from here and there, you know, inappropriately inserted into a judgment, says, of course you can. Now, at that point, the people who have been used to use the courts to assert their rights are like for example, the lawyers. In Sri Lanka, the Bar Association has become strongly assertive of their rights. But what can they do? Of course, they also have the same alternative like others to take to the street. But what do you do in the courts? So, the one, I think, issue that is not simply for now, but simply that had been unresolved from the colonial transfer of power up to now, that dysfunctional legal system, the impact that it has on the whole democratization process and the creation of manipulation of these processes under certain circumstances by people in power and virtually paralyzing the nations. Now these are issues I think should, particularly in the developed countries, should receive the attention of people like yours, because you all are more with the more concerned persons who are watching what is happening. See, the one problem of any discourse is the experiences that are so different makes it impossible to understand what somebody may be saying. Now, if you have seen certain reasonable development of your policing system, You may think that a person who says our policing does their investigations through torture and there are so many cases of torture, this may be an exaggeration. Because your experience about this within the over a century is different to what your ancestors experienced before that. Your ancestor would have understood us better because they suffered the similar circumstances like this before the power and other could have manipulated legal system, the police. There are, a very remarkable book, I think, which should receive attention, is by two American authors who have worked in Africa and also Asia, called The Locus Effect. The lawyer's name is one of the authors' name is Gary Hogan. Locus Effect. But describe this very graphically and the impact of that in the human rights the development from 1948. The locus effect means, the normal locust, like they go and eat up the grain when the grain is coming up at that point, so virtually destroy the effort of the farmer. The poor in our countries, whatever they earn, there are many to scourge on the poor man's little dollar or two he earns. So the Millennium Goal approach of increasing the amount is not the solution to this problem. The protection that is available, that should be available to the citizen, should be available to the poor. And that is being denied through the legal system. The police either don't take them seriously whenever they want to make complaints, who can make it very difficult. In many countries, the complaint is, even getting a complaint registered is an uphill task. Now, other ways that somebody else can make use of giving bribes to put an innocent man into trouble, and then again, people who want to help, runs the problems within of the legal system. When a system does not properly function, it must still give the appearance of being functioning. The courts have to every day to have cases. The police have every day to be doing something. So very often, when there is a crime that is unresolved, somebody who has not done the crime is being substituted, arrested, because you have to show that they have been doing something. And we have been documenting this in a very large scale and very shocking to us. We find that about the 80% of cases of torture that we have documented, these people have not been involved in any crime at all. They have got beaten up too much because they are innocent and the police don't believe that they are innocent, and they demand not so much getting a confession, but if they are arrested for theft, they say, give that thing that you have taken. Somebody says that my gold item has been, stolen. So what the police want is, please give the gold. If he has not stolen, he cannot give the gold. Of course, he can sign a confession. Anybody when tortured, they can sign a confession and say, I am the one who did it. And if that is the way to escape. But if you are demanding that you should be given something that you are not stolen, people can't do that. And those people get beaten more because the police assume that these are stubborn guys. Even after beating, somewhat, they don't, so then they have to be beaten more. And the kind of, to level to which they go, at least one book is available, few copies. The 400 cases of torture we documented, you can get a glance. So I'm talking to you of some of the very formidable problems which we meet at the grassroots level in terms of the legal systems. And unfortunately, people who work in this area, particularly at the international level, are very limited. Because we had this assumption that in 1948, we had the Universal Declaration. Then from 1960s, we have, the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic Rights, thereafter many conventions. And if these conventions are ratified by the governments, and thereafter if they bring a domestic law, virtually that task is accomplished. International project achieves its aim. And of course you can put few rapporteurs to monitor, and when you get complaints, the rapporteurs in turn give the recommendation to the government, investigate this matter and prosecute. When the investigating and the prosecuting mechanism doesn't work, the recommendations, merely gather one after the other from year to year, and nothing really happens. But it has not become, part of the analysis to find out, is these systems, how to change these systems, how to develop critique over these systems, how to help build international opinion about these system problems, how to, encourage governments to negotiate on these issues, how to develop a civil society movement which are talking about these issues. See, restriction of civil society liberty is not only something happens only from governments. It can happen by ourselves. If our own perspectives are limited, if you are not talking about the issues that we should be talking about, and if you merely adjust into a model of doing things that everybody does, and say, then we are doing human right, I think we are working in a way that it is self-defeating. It is essential to have a conversation on justice to brought into the center of the human rights discourse. If this begin to happen, you will find many results emerging. But if the conversation itself is missing, it is not possible for changes to happen. The conversation, every right development, whether it is on slavery, whether it was remarkable achievements made on the women's rights issues, you will find happens with those who build that conversation in a hard, difficult time. And I'm talking in the presence of somebody, here who have received the award this time, who have created that kind of conversation in a very hard circumstances in their country. Honor killings, the people being killed simply because they marry somebody who love, and this kind of very difficult issues people to understand were made to understand, and at least there are more people thinking about and trying to work on it because a conversation was created. We need today a conversation on justice, and that conversation on justice can break these limitations that we are talking about. Shrinking space can be regained, and it is not some abstract idea. You see, every country in Asia, you will see how they have done it in different times. Military dictatorships have been brought down. The kind of formidable kind of suppressions that have been there. After that, the things again have begun to grow. Anybody who has seen Cambodia in 1993 would think, when will anybody, when you talk to the Minister of Justice, at that time I have talked on behalf of the UN, and we very politely tells him, the independence of judiciary, there are some, really some problems in the country. The minister turned to you and say, don't worry about this. I will make them independent. Can you see the depth of the lack of even a notion? In that setup, there's not even a notion. What does this independence of judiciary means? In those countries, people now today, there are many people who have learned what these basics are, and people, the growing demand for democracy, and they have shown that effect in elections, which are one of the most difficult elections held because of manipulation of the system. But more and more people are regaining, their lost space. The regaining lost space, I think we we are looking into perhaps the kind of decades we will see some remarkable changes into some of the problems which remain unresolved in the area of rights. But to achieve that space, particularly using the kind of communication capacities that have arisen, changing the conversation, improving the conversation, and taking the idea of justice first into every household can make a huge difference. I talk hopefully, although difficulties are many, and all the difficulties that I talk about are real. But on the other hand, the strength of that the people have been showing, that is far beyond what we human rights people or anybody can imagine. People have shown, it is not a slogan, people have shown they can defeat this. And I think it is up to us to go to more difficult questions, raise the questions that are, in fact, hindering the progress. When people come to street, they do things, at the end they go back and find after 5 years we have not got what we wanted. Because a discourse did not precede. That once we get rid of some of these people, what next? And that discourse on justice, I believe, at least regarding the developed countries, must become the central theme of the human rights discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basil Fernando, for this very thought-provoking speech, and we will be most pleased to come back to you with questions afterwards in a joint discussion. But let me now welcome our second speaker. Asma Jahangir is Pakistan's leading human rights lawyer. Having founded the first legal aid center in Pakistan in 1986, Jahangir has courageously taken on very complicated cases and won. She made history when she was elected as the first female president of the Supreme Court Bar Association of Pakistan in 2010. And Asma Jahangir will receive the Right Livelihood Award for defending, protecting, and promoting human rights in Pakistan and more widely, often in very difficult and complex situations and at great personal risk. So please join me in welcoming Asma Jahangir.
Well, thank you very much. Let me first of all welcome my dear friend Thomas Hammerberg, who is here. And for me, Sweden and Thomas are the same thing. And our ambassador who is here, and all the friends and colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting us to Sweden. I think that we have many common areas, Basil and myself, because when we talk about shrinking space, there is no doubt that there has been a shrinking of space, but there also have been new opportunities in our part of the world, particularly where we have transited from dictatorship to democracy. Because democracy by itself has its own phenomena where people are willing to talk and where people must be heard. Not always, but at least they try to be heard. We have had, for example, in Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, a transition. Afghanistan is post-conflict, and you can imagine that when the Taliban were there was no space. They lived in a space. At least now, the women's groups, other organizations are beginning to speak up, beginning to think about their future, still in very difficult circumstances. But then there are new challenges that we are facing. And I have to say that these new challenges, some of them are connected to post-September 11th. Because after September 11th, the world was not focusing on human rights. They were focusing on terrorism. I am against terrorism. I don't like terrorism. But I do not wish to kill everybody in the name of terrorism. And I think that that is the difference. The world has become dependent on intelligence services and security services. Bessel was talking about how he was told just now of what justice is about a minister. And with due pardon to our ambassador, very recently I was asked by the Prime Minister to go and see, we have now 2 foreign ministers. Isn't that so? But I was asked to go and see one of them. And I went there to have a chat with him about how our country can raise its standards on human rights in the Human Rights Council. But I was given a lecture by the foreign minister, and he said to me that the best model of human rights was China, and that I must learn from his wisdom and experience. And next he told me that Sri Lanka was quite a success because look at the way they've dealt with Tamils, not LTT, but Tamils, which he thought was a marvelous example of killing people by the state. And thirdly, he warned me that I must never look at human rights from a Western perspective because we have a very good Eastern perspective of human rights. And therefore, cultural relativism, social norms of the East must be woven into now a new basket of human rights that he was thinking of pioneering from Pakistan. So at that point, I left in a hurry, saying to him, thank you very much for your lecture. At least now I know what we are confronted with next. Fortunately, his ideas stayed in his room. But I can tell you from where I come from, that not only in my country, but even in countries that are neighboring countries, we have seen the worst kind of counter-terrorism laws that we have experienced. Whether it is in Sri Lanka, or indeed in India, which Sri Lanka and India both pride themselves as very mature democracies. We have seen counter-terrorism laws in Pakistan that the Western world has not even criticized because it is for the so-called terrorist now. But I, being a lawyer, I am sometimes torn because I don't only fight for the rights of terrorists or suspected terrorists, but I think they too have their rights. And therefore, it becomes very difficult for me to have to be answerable to my colleagues who say to me, why have you gone and challenged this law? Because a number of terrorists have been under custody and detained, and if they are let out, they will be held in this country. But I do feel that if something is started in the name of anti-terrorism, it will one day come to me as well. And the reason I say that I have seen this in practical life. After September 11th, our intelligence agencies were encouraged to pick up people and hand them over to the CIA to be taken to Guantanamo Bay. And there started the disappearances. And so when our intelligence agencies felt that the so-called leader of human rights is themselves condoning disappearances of people, then they can help themselves too. If they can help the US, why shouldn't they help themselves? And so it was not only suspected terrorists, though that is bad enough, who were handed over and disappeared, but a large number of students, nationalists from Baloch disappeared. Some have returned, tortured, brutalized. Others continue to come back, their bodies in guinea bags. And this, I'm afraid, was started in the name of counterterrorism. We have 2 laws in our country. One which gives wide powers to security apparatus to keep people under custody for months and months on end in both provincial and federal territories, federal FATA and PATA they are called. And indeed, people have been in custody for the last 4 years, tortured. We have been in court. Some people were called in court. They gave testimony that they were tortured. Nobody from their house was allowed to meet them. and yet the courts did not act. And these are, Mr. Fernando, the courts that you said went too far. Similarly, in the cases of disappearances, what courts are doing now is paying a lot of lip service to media. But when it comes to actual justice, I find very little of it. Secondly, not only counterterrorism, but journalists are being bought in most parts of my country, and I know that journalists have been tortured in your country. And even in India, there's a fabulous book called, it's not Calcutta Boy, it's Aligarh Boy, about a journalist, and he shows how the state works and how the state influences journalists even in India. And it is the way that corporations and big businesses have taken over media, and they work in cahoots with the government. So the old kind of journalism where you had editors sitting independent, churning out newspapers day after day and staying completely independent has gone. It's a journalism of sound bites, a journalism that is run through vested interest, and if you don't go along with the tides, you're threatened. And the number of journalists who have died in our subcontinent have been far more than any other. We have places of conflict, and in conflict areas, space is even less. Very recently, just as we are here, one of our colleagues of the Human Rights Commission and escaped the country because he was going to be picked up and was warned earlier. His family was picked up, tortured, their nails taken out. And when I read that news, I wish that I had been back there to speak up for them. But I will as I go back, because I think this is unacceptable. And it is unacceptable in countries like myself where we call ourselves democracy. But even the elected democratic leaders of our country cannot challenge the intelligence or the security apparatus, because they owe their existence and their continuance to their non-interference. We have an increasing role of non-state actors, not only in my country, but in the entire region, where governments feel incapacitated, not able to resolve the issue despite all efforts, because these non-state actors have become so big that they have become a challenge not only to national governments but to the international community itself. The state who wants to protect people finds itself incapable of doing it. And because they find themselves incapable of doing it, they don't want the word to go out of the country that there has been a large number of human rights violations, particularly where there are conflicts between non-state actors and national armies or national security forces. Naturally, non-state actors have abused human rights, no doubt, but they are not responsible, unfortunately, in the same manner as state actors are. And when words gets out that state actors have violated human rights, then monitoring of civil society starts. The space for civil society shrinks. The space for media and journalists shrinks. And the space for even citizens who want to give the information out is no longer there. Because even if they get it out, there's nobody left to relay that information because of fear from the security agencies on the one hand and the non-state militant actors on the other hand. The way the non-state actors are now started terrorism in our part of the world, we have seen a new low in the barbarism that we are experiencing. It's in the barbarism of violence. It's not killing, it's mutilation. It's playing football with people's heads. And it's what you call dehumanizing complete societies. that is, I think, abhorrent in many ways. We have also religious militancy, not only in Pakistan, but if you look at India, whole politics is turned into communal politics, and politics is run on communalism. There is killing in the name of religion, and once that takes place, freedom of expression is almost denied. And we witness that, for example, when people in my country are killed under the laws of blasphemy. Fortunately, a few examples in the recent past, which were glaring examples of barbarism, have outraged people, and we are hoping that things will change gradually. But I hope that they will change surely. Non-reporting, I've already talked about, even in Sri Lanka. And monitoring of NGOs have happened in different ways. Governments have tried to get NGOs to register, not only to monitor where they get their money from, or to make them accountable, for which I think nobody has any objection to, but to monitor exactly who is working in the office and what they're doing and who their contacts are. And that can be very dangerous. And that is beginning to happen in most countries of at least South Asia. There is the whole question, and I will end here, that I think my friend has talked about, the question of governance. People want a right. Now, it's almost become a right to good governance. That is the demand of the people. Governments are not willing to understand that, are not willing to take that challenge up. They don't want to elect governments that will come there, that will have more of the same, but they want governments that will deliver. Governments that will institutionalize, governments that will strengthen rule of law. And when we are talking of rule of law, I do realize Sri Lanka was one country where everybody would pride and say their judiciary is completely independent, but I'm happy to say they have gone our way. So we don't feel any inferior to you anymore. But even in Bangladesh, and if you notice what is happening in the USA, I think the message is quite clear, that judges are not unaccountable. Because in the past, judges felt that once they have given the judgment, they have done their work and their duty and it's over. And it must be read as the gospel truth. I think time has now come to challenge those who sit in the seat of justice and are appointed for their integrity and for their competence, but deliver neither. I often say to the judges in Pakistan that out of so many millions, you're 17. Can you imagine how honored you must feel and what level of integrity you must have and the level of competence you must have? But alas, I wish that I could have justified the 17 to be there. It's not just a question of rule of law. What is rule of law is also very different. When you talk to judges of the subcontinent, at least, for them rule of law is something so abstract, is something like a man with a suit and a tie that walks into a men's club with dignity. And I have tried to tell them that rule of law, and many of our colleagues have tried to tell them, that rule of law is where every child, where every woman, regardless of which background they come from, and every human being has a level playing field. And rule of law is where everybody has equal access to justice. Not only political justice, but also economic justice. And there we are slow to learn. And particularly in societies like ourselves, where economic disparity is just deafening, we have to pay more attention to it. And if we don't continue to pay attention to it, I'm afraid that already we are seeing in the world that we are not moving towards conflict, we are also moving towards anarchy. And that anarchy has come from denial of justice. denial of equal opportunities, and denial to pay attention to chronic human rights abuses that have taken place in many parts of the world, and we have just turned our face the other way. So let me just relate to you, for you particularly, Mr. Fernando, that when I was a young lawyer, I had a senior lawyer ask me, what would you do if you went to court and a judge said to you, Mrs. Jahangir, this is not what the law says, this is what the law says. So being absolutely abrasive at that point, which I still am, I said to him, I'll tell the judge he's wrong. He said, no, you should say to the judge, my lord, I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Let me put it your way and then put it your way again. And he said to me, if he says again the same thing to you, that no, this is again you're saying the same thing, you're absolutely wrong, what would you say? So I sort of shrugged my shoulders and said, what then? He said, then you will say, my lord is so right. Maybe, my lord, I have not made myself comprehensible to you, but let me try it again your way. And then you put your own point of view forward. And then he said, if the judge says again a third time, what will you say? So I said, I will say, my lord has not understood. He said, no. The third time you will say, your lord is incapable of understanding what I have been trying to tell your lordship. And if your lordship may so disagree, you may, but this is what the law says. And I think that is what we need to tell our lordships in at least Asia, that they have not yet understood what rule of law means. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Asma. Actually, I would like to welcome you back up to have a seat here together with Basil, and we will start the Q&A session also. So please, microphones are still on. Please have a seat up here, and we will have microphones also, and please state your name and if you represent an organization, and if you have comments or questions for the audience. I would like perhaps to start to invite Thomas Hammarberg to this discussion. You have worked with human rights and for many, many years, both in Sweden and internationally. So who could be better to start this discussion off, please?
Okay, thank you. I was extremely pleased when I heard about the decision by the jury for the prize this year, of course, because we have here two extremely important human rights defenders in one important part of the world. And I began to think about history there and went back to the World Conference on Human Rights 1993, more than 2 decades ago. And there were two things there which was absolutely of great importance. Before the conference, some of the Asian governments had promoted the concept of Asian values. And the idea was that this will be an alternative to human rights. And the idea was that human rights is actually a concept promoted by some Western countries who really don't know the reality in our part of the world. And for us, they said, the spearhead was done by Singapore, Malaysia was there, Pakistan was one of the voices in that discussion, Sri Lanka was part of it, China supported it, so it was a big block of countries that stood behind this. And frankly, there was a nervousness about the whole conference. United Nations, big human rights conference, was a risk that we would backslide when it comes to the respect of the agreed standards. And they said that human rights is not really of essence importance for us because we have solidarity within the communities, we protect the interest of the family and things like that, but individual human rights is not for us. What changed the atmosphere was a statement coming from the non-governmental groups in Asia. those who were the human rights defenders in those countries. Asma was certainly one of them, and that changed the whole atmosphere, because here we had a more genuine voice from the people in those countries that stood up against fairly corrupt governments in that discussion, and that changed the atmosphere of the conference and was of great importance. Both of our laureates here have continued the work for genuine human rights since then. The other thing I was thinking about was there was a non-governmental meeting in the basement, symbolically, in Vienna, and it was a very difficult conference down there. There were about 4,000 or 5,000 people there in the same big room, and it came to a climax when Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States, was to speak, and there were an organized attempt to silence him. Some extremists stood up on chairs and booed him, so he couldn't be heard. And Jimmy Carter talked and talked and talked. No one heard what he said. And in the end, he left after his silent speech. And there was a chaos in the room, a total chaos. And the question, how do we handle this situation? The human rights non-governmental community has prevented someone who was invited to speak to tell his words to the audience there. And he was a former official, of course, but he was also running some causes for human rights at that time. Then one person stood up from the back, trying to get through to the rostrum, and she took the microphone and spoke, and it was Asma. And her speech there was an excellent lecture of what it means to stand by freedom of speech, and that one would, even if one disagreed, give the other side a chance to state his or her opinion. And then the atmosphere also in that meeting changed. And this is sort of a reflection of the deep understanding and engagement for human rights that Asma did represent in that meeting, but also, of course, in other meetings. So I think we cannot thank enough the efforts by our friends in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, Cambodia as well, of course, and other countries in Asia, and the efforts they've made through the years to stand up against this notion that human rights is only for the developed countries or United States, Europe, etc. It is something that is genuinely universal. And we have a lot to learn from their struggle for real human rights. One thing that came through in the conference, and was also a result of this, was that there is a clear link between civil and political rights and economic and social rights. They go together. It's the same package. And this is one message that has not been still fully understood in our parts of the world. And the fight against poverty is a human rights battle. And that's an important message. So I tried to think what question should I ask, but I just want to underline the absolute importance of what has been said here, what they have done in the past, and the 2 points that Asma raised about the situation of journalists, the consistent trend in all over the world today to commercialize the media and to, by that, silence independent reporting which is going on, and the absolute need for public service, genuine public service, for instance, is there. So there's something there which is of great importance. And the other point she made about the role of security. We are now under a tremendous surveillance. And the authorities know so much about us in a situation where we know very little on how they are taking the decisions. So that, of course, relates to another of the laureates here this year, which I think has contributed a lot to an understanding of what is at stake when it comes to protecting our integrity.
Thank you very much for sharing those memories and bringing on those aspects also to the speakers of today. And we will return to this issue also, freedom of speech, at a seminar Monday morning, also in collaboration with the Right Livelihood Award Foundation. So, but if you have any more comments on that, I know you touched upon this Eastern human rights, Asma, also in your speech, and the Western human rights, and that's an issue I think that is still very ongoing in this struggle where the world is heading, this feeling of that we are moving in a chaotic direction, and that the fundaments that actually the universal human rights have been for many years, that it's also questioned in this streaming. So how can what's your reflection on that? Is there can they comprehend traditional culture and values easily, or is that also a struggle? Is it a struggle between East and West, or what's going on?
Well, I don't think it's a struggle between East and West. I think it's a struggle between people who believe in human rights and those that don't. I think it's a struggle between people who believe that dignity is for everyone and those who believe dignity is only for them and for not lesser mortals like women and children and the poor. I think that we need human rights much more than people in the developed countries. And we need democracy much more. When I'm told that people are not educated in Pakistan, so why should you have democracy? I think precisely for that reason we should have democracy. Because people are so marginalized that that is one chance they have of being able to make themselves felt. And that right to vote is an important right for them. I have seen, for example, in my work, and believe me, I work very much on the grassroots as well, nobody has ever come and said to me, no, I don't want dignity, that's a Western concept. Or I don't mind being tortured because I am a black person, you know. Or that, oh, it's okay, leave me in prison because I'm used to it. And I have heard people in my own country say, you know, they're poor people, they have nothing to eat. And one day, when I was, there was a lot of bonded labor that we liberated in the province of Sindh, thousands of people. And there was a criticism that, why am I doing that when I cannot rehabilitate them? But I simply, and our organizations that we represented, simply did not have the skills to rehabilitate. So I asked them one day, and I said to this leader of the group, I said, look, we are going on liberating them, but I feel very guilty because the papers are saying that you're liberating them, but where will you get them something to eat? I mean, how will they survive? So he heard me out, and then he looked at me and he said in his own language, you carry on doing what you're doing. So I said, where will you get a living from? He says to me, if I am only born to have food, I can also go to jail and I'll get food there. But I need dignity just like you need dignity. So you carry on your work and don't question my dignity. I will find food for myself. I'm not asking you to find me food. I'm asking you to do what you can do. And I looked at him and I thought, well, that's what he wants and that's his decision. And that is what is so important to everyone. Even to children. I have worked with children in jails, and believe me, when you're talking to them, they have been, whatever has happened to them, the worst thing that they will tell you is where they've been humiliated. Even worse, that he said that, okay, the police came, they pushed me in, this, that, and the other, was not with tears. But then he said this about my mother, was humiliation, and they will start to cry. And they can never forget. And I've seen these children now, some of them are grown up, and some still come and see me, and they say, we can never forget humiliation. We can forget everything else, but we cannot. And they don't have to be in the West to know that. So I think anyone who talks in terms of East or West is themselves dividing society and themselves demeaning themselves by saying we don't have as much dignity. I think our poor people, our women, our children who suffer and challenge and negotiate there have far more dignity, that even after everything they can still hold their heads up high and walk out and talk to people.
Basil.
Yeah. I'd like to shortly comment on this because what Mr. Hammerberg has raised was one of the main issues around which the Asian Human Rights Commission developed. We found that these leaders are engaged in a big bluff. This was propaganda. This was not what they believe. This was not what the people believed. But they were taking it in a nationalizing, kind of romanticizing the kind of an Asian idea. So we thought how to answer to this question. And the way we tried to answer that was we started a discussion called an Asian Charter on Human Rights. The whole exercise was for the purpose to show that, you talk big about being Asian. How do you treat a person who comes to your police station? You beat him up. Now, is it the privilege of Asian to get beaten up at police stations? We asked them, how do you treat a person who goes to a fair trial? Do you give them a fair trial? Now, but the question was, you had to show the dirt that was there, but it was covered with nice flowery languages and all kinds of romanticization. So we began to document in detail the kind of absolute lack of justice systems in these countries. Is it the fate of Asian to live without the defense of their rights by a system of justice? Now, that of course, they never entered into that debate because they could not enter into that debate. So there was this kind of a, taking it purely on a culturally this and culturally that and all this it was as the Lee Kuan Yew later admitted, well, I didn't mean it very much. I think the way to answer this issue of cultural issue is, as she has already raised, how the life of Asian is being brought to highly undignified levels, high levels of humiliation, deprivation levels by the denial of rights through the legal system itself. These people who did that argument had no moral ground to stand on. Lee Kuan Yew, while maintaining, prisons where people have been kept for no reason at all. In 1987, about 23 young people were arrested when they were doing church work. They were helping refugees and things like that. And these people were just taken up, and Lee Kuan Yew accused them of, trying to overthrow his government. These are people who did not, I know some of them personally. The leader was the seminarian called the Vincent Chen. These people had not even a real, radicalism in them. But idea was there should be no space for civil society activity. Entire space must be claimed by the state. If you do charity, I do charity. The government does charity. You don't need to do charity. If the church is teaching religion, I will tell you what to teach and what not to teach. So there was at that time the Latin American issue, the liberation theology and all that. So he began to monitor, and virtually intimidating bishops and people. Well, if you want to, remain here, this is the way to do it. So absolute control, that could be done by people who have a complete absence of respect for their citizens. They did not say that this is Asian values on behalf of their citizens. They said it on their behalf to protect power, while doing the worst kinds of violations in some of these people are very good at. So I think there we have to locate where the debate is. Locate what this is about. Why are so sensitive when you talk about human rights? Because their people will rise against them. They will ask them. So Singapore, up to date, there is not even inquiry into these things. The longest political prisoner is, was from Singapore, Chia Taipo. He was there for 27 years in prison for nothing except that he was a parliamentarian one time, and the Lee Kuan Yew did not want opposition parliamentarians. There is only one party, and then nobody, is allowed to, except for symbolic reason, allowing a small space. So is that what it to be a Asian? See, I think we need to not to be in the defensive in this kind of discussions, to turn it offensive and ask, is what you want and what the people want the same? Of course not. So today the race in the whole issue of extremely cruel policing, extremely corrupt type of policing, the manipulation of Lee Kuan Yew, where is in the Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore independent judges? That's a commodity you won't find there. The basic absence of justice to the people, and when that question is raised up, many of them will not raise this issue about cultural rights.
Thank you.